Over time.
Watts. Composer over
With Nick Virzi.
composer
over time.
Watts
Composer over time.
with Andrew over
Composer over Virzi.
composer and
Composer over time. Composer over time.
Andrew Watts.
Composer over.
Welcome to Composer Overtime. My name is Andrew Watts.
And I'm Nick Virzi.
Composer Overtime is a series of interviews featuring discussions and works by innovative composers across the world today. Nick and I are both composers based at Stanford University and will be facilitating these chats each week, sometimes with Bay Area guests, and sometimes on location across the U.S. and internationally.
During each episode, we will hear a new perspective on the contemporary music landscape, find out about the composer's creative process and musical background, as well as listen to some of their recent work.
This week will be a slight departure from our typical format. In order to provide more insight into the perspective of this interview series, the guest today will be my Composer Overtime co-host, Nick Virzi. Nick is an American composer living in Woodside, California. He has participated in a number of top festivals and residencies, such as Impuls, the Cortona Sessions, and SoundSCAPE. Similarly, his works have been premiered by several leading artists and ensembles today, including cellist Séverine Ballon, soprano Tony Arnold, the Los Angeles Percussion Quartet, the JACK Quartet, Spektral Quartet, Splinter Reeds, Quince Contemporary Vocal Ensemble, Liminar, Distractfold Ensemble, the TAK Ensemble, and the Ekmeles Vocal Ensemble. Nick began his university education in composition at SUNY Purchase Conservatory of Music, where he studied with Du Yun, Huang Ruo, and Suzanne Farrin. Nick completed his doctorate at Stanford University, where he studied with Mark Applebaum and Brian Ferneyhough. Currently, Nick teaches an original course entitled Wild Sound Explorers at the Stanford Summer Arts Institute and Stanford International Institutes. It was a highly fruitful interview that will be available online unbroken. So without further ado, here's my chat with Nick Virzi. I don't know who's welcoming who here.
I don't know. Well, we're at my house, so I guess I'll welcome you, but you can welcome me as well.
Okay, welcome, Nick.
Thank you, Andrew.
So, I should say, first of all, congratulations. You just completed your dissertation defense.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, 48 hours ago or something?
Yeah, that was just a blink of an eye ago. And then congrats to you also. It was just, 2 or 3 weeks ago at this point, right?
Yeah, two and a half weeks ago.
Yeah, so 2 new doctors interviewing each
Watch
other.
out.
That's right.
Yeah. So I think this is a great place to start out. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding with our field in terms of what a composer does and what the career looks like in the United States of a composer, especially a composer who's writing concert music or music that's more experimental in nature. So what is the academic process of being a composer?
What is the academic process?
Yes.
I think on some level, part of the academic process is surviving the academic process as an artist. So I don't know that, I'm just speaking for myself here, but I never intended to enter academia for the purpose of being an academic. It was really something that I knew I wanted to explore what I was doing a lot deeper, but mainly as an artistic pursuit. Academia and kind of that deeper intellectual sense of discovery is, in my view, a way to very rigorously explore those things as they relate to your own practice. So for me, it really has been kind of understanding the academic world in how it can apply to my art making, and kind of at the same time really not let all of the, shall we say, systematic and dry aspects of being an academic kind of taint your artistic sensibility. How can you kind of, like I said, survive through that in such a way that it really makes it all worth it in the end in terms of being an artist. And then with the understanding that, you've actually done a lot of good research along the way. You've done a lot of good investigation into things that you were interested at the time, or things that kind of came up throughout the process. But I think that that's really the biggest challenge.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Although I'm sure, again, some people really are academics and really do think of themselves as being people who their main purpose is to kind of purely research things and disseminate information.
Sure. I think it's a tricky term because it has this history within the arts, particularly within composition. If you call something, that's academic, then it means that's dry, that's boring, that's overly intellectualized, and it doesn't have the same artistic merit. Whereas most of the composers that we know are at least tangentially affiliated with universities. So it's how it is today in the United States, and I think that this pushback is a bit of a straw man argument.
I think it's a really odd thing to self-criticize. It's the sort of thing where it's kind of part of the accepted trajectory of what a composer can pursue in order to really make something of themselves and be supported, even just kind of financially, or also, you have to be able to support yourself through your life if you want to be able to make the music you want to make. And it was always the case, I think, that musicians and composers in particular throughout history had to, in some way, subvert themselves or fit in within another system which allowed them to do what they wanted to do. You have Haydn living at Esterhazy and composing basically for somebody else. You have all these other royal court composers who are part of that system. And it's a system of patronage which comes along with its own influences and comes along with its own drawbacks, but at the same time really is a vehicle for allowing these things to exist in the first place. So I think it's sort of a very odd thing to resent, because it really is the thing that allows you to take what it is you're doing to the next level.
It's your support.
Exactly.
You're biting the hand that feeds.
Yeah, and I think that you should nibble on the hand, from time to time if it seems to not be allowing you to do the thing that you set out to do. Let's say, like, if the goal from the beginning was to be a better artist, but you find yourself at the end of your degree feeling like you don't want to be an artist anymore, then you shouldn't necessarily blame the degree. You should blame the fact that you weren't able to survive your way through it. You weren't able to find the thing that allowed you to hold on to that sense of, well, what is that profound thing that got you started in the first place? And I think that academia is a challenging world because it makes it difficult to hold on to those sorts of things. But I think for people who are willing and resilient, they can kind of survive that, and more than just survive it, it can really help them in the end. It's not something for the faint of heart.
Sure.
And neither is composing. It's something that you really have to be committed to it and work very, very hard if you want to make it happen.
Yeah, I think one of the unfortunate aspects about composition within a university, especially if you're studying at the graduate level, is the risk of having a mismatch between your own artistic objectives and your institution's, your department, your advisors' goals for your work. And I feel I've been very fortunate in that they were kind of all in line from the beginning. But I do hear of these horror stories of people who just want to do this just want to write this sort of music, and they feel stifled because everyone else at their institution is kind of pushing them into some other direction.
Yeah, I think it happens in both ways, right? It happens where you find yourself in a context where it's really not suited in some way to what it is you're doing. And then there are also situations where everything is kind of laid out in front of you for the taking, but you feel insecure and you feel that whatever it is you were doing really isn't good enough or not properly suited to the institution that you're within. And that's a difficult thing to kind of parse apart, because part of it is an imposition from the external world, and part of it is something that you yourself do to yourself. And I mean, it's never black and white like that. It always ends up being, I think, a combination of those two forces. And I think what's been most helpful for me in terms of how I consider my own role in that is to, on the one hand, recognize that whichever of those institutional forces, let's say, that are preventing you from doing something, in many cases, if the degree was in the service of your artistic pursuit in the first place, you have to be willing to say, I'm not going to play along with this because it's really going to damage me in the end, and it's going to ultimately be bad for me. And then there are the other things, which is they're entirely under your control. They are things that you are deluding yourself into thinking that you have to conform to this thing, or that you have to not conform to this thing, that you have to you can't just look at yourself and go, yeah, I'm happy with this, you know? And so you have to be willing to kind of, on the one hand, acknowledge the things that are not part of yourself, which you can reject, and then the other things which are a part of yourself that you have to accept.
Right.
And if you do that, I think that really nobody can fault you. I mean, people are going to fault you either way.
Sure.
You know, even if you try to play ball. Actually, I think it's even deeper than that. If you try to play ball in a way that doesn't actually speak to your own sensibilities, you're shooting yourself in the foot, and you're going to fail according to those terms, because you're not going to have the motivation that's required to really dig deep and make something out of what you were trying to do.
And I think there is an important distinction between this mismatch that I had outlined briefly and just being challenged.
Yeah, sure.
Being challenged aesthetically, being challenged from a standpoint of your technique, being challenged academically. Of course, that's not only important, but I would say is the foundation of, these advanced studies.
Mm-hmm.
Let's backtrack a little bit.
Sure.
And try to get to the path that you took to the doctorate.
Sure, yeah. I've had a winding path.
Yeah,
I'll put it that way.
So how did you get into music?
Well, my mother likes to say that I was born with the nutcracker playing. And,
okay.
Yeah, so I was brought up kind of in this bizarre mixture of worlds where I'm from New York City, and I would often, as a child, go with my mother to the ballet. So she herself used to dance, and I think she still does dance in some ways. And she was really taken with Tchaikovsky in particular. So we used to go see Swan Lake and the Nutcracker and things like this. But then my father, on the other hand, was kind of like a hippie in his own way. Not really like the huge stereotype and everything, but he was very much into like Pink Floyd and Led Zeppelin and all that sort of music. And these were kind of the influences that were around the house when I was a kid. Although I didn't necessarily engage with them until I was a bit older, because it was more that I was a kid and I was kind of in this naive haze watching the Nutcracker every Christmas with my mother and my father, my brother. And I appreciated it for what it was. I played the trombone at the time, and I really enjoyed watching the trombonists in the orchestra. But then I didn't actually really start to engage with music, I think, once I picked up the guitar when I was about 13 or so. Mm-hmm. And I studied guitar for about, 5 years or so with the same teacher, who is this avant-garde jazz guitarist who was from Sweden. And he was a huge influence on me also, because his music taste was very eclectic, and he would share things with me kind of ranging from Yngwie Malmsteen to Webern and Frank Zappa and, a whole cast of characters. So I think from the very beginning I had a very pluralistic sort of take on on the kind of music that I found interesting at the very least.
Were you writing music at this time?
I didn't really write music when I was young, and I didn't really listen to music when I was young either. I kind of played around with instruments, but it wasn't really anything very articulated or formed. And I first started writing music basically around the time that I first started playing guitar. I remember kind of hearing someone playing the guitar, kind of seeing it around town, kind of being drawn to it in this sort of way. And then once I started to pick it up, I started to really more focus on different kind of effects that could come out of it rather than like playing different songs. And so my first experiments in composition, if you could call them that, were really these quite elaborate tape pieces that I would develop with very, very primitive technology, like just like a goosehead microphone that was plugged in USB into my like Windows 98 computer or something, and recorded straight into Audacity. And I would do a lot of like multi-layered tape pieces that were just, how many different sounds can I get out of the guitar? And on top of that, how can I use basic processing, like adding reverb or even just editing things close together? How can I make kind of an orchestra of sorts from that sort of thing? And so I had a lot of weird experiments that came out of that, mostly influenced, I would say, at that time by Frank Zappa was kind of a big influence, along with all of the other music that I was interested in at the time. I was really into rock music at that point. In particular, some of my favorite bands were like, again, sort of, coming from my father's influence, Pink Floyd, Led Zeppelin, Metallica was a big obsession of mine for a while when I was in high school. And so my music, I think, at that time had this element of alienness, but at the same time, a great degree of intensity and rawness. And eventually I think what happened was I began to be attracted to the more sophisticated bands, the bands who were developing a language that was, on the one hand, aesthetically interesting, and on the other hand, conceptually gripping. And that's one reason why I was attracted to Pink Floyd, for example. It's another reason why I was attracted to Metallica, I think, because as a guitar player, I was interested both in the things that I wanted to play, but also the things that kind of, as a composer, or as a emerging composer of sorts, spoke to me as just aspects of good songwriting. But eventually what happened was I realized that a lot of these bands kind of reached a limit in terms of the interest that I had in them. So if I was really looking for something that was technically sophisticated, I had to kind of expand into a larger world of music. And I remember probably the first experience where...
By technically sophisticated, you're talking about the formal structures, or are you talking about the technique?
The formal structures, the instrumental technique. Okay. And even, I guess both, like down to like the level of figuration I suppose I could leave it at that description. I think that probably the first few pieces that I heard that really made a huge impact on me as things that would sort of bridge the gap between the like raw rock, heavy metal energy and the classical music world were kind of shown to me through some of my high school music teachers, actually. I think probably the earliest piece that I can remember that really made a huge impact was probably the Emperor Concerto from Beethoven. And then also around the same time as when I found The Rite of Spring. And that was a watershed moment also, both because it retained that sort of energy, or not retained, it preceded it, right? It was something that was kind of a dark intensity that was preserved throughout history, that kind of emerged in the music that I liked, that was, more colloquial and part of the immediate lexicon of my environment growing up. But it was something that I was immediately attracted to, for sure.
Are there elements in those early experiences with Beethoven, with rock, with the Stravinsky that you can identify in your compositional practice today?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the thing that struck me the most about Stravinsky was that it had, on the one hand, this completely dramatic difference from Beethoven, let's say, linguistically, but that there was this continuity of spirit that continued throughout. And that's to say that, like, I perceived that same sort of spirit, if you want to call it that, in the music that I was attracted to later on from, the 1980s and such, the rock music. So I think that in many ways, a lot of how I consider that music and how it still informs me to this day is the fact that despite the linguistic architecture that allows something to come forth, there is a commonality that's being preserved over time. There is some sort of universality that exists despite the language which frames it. And and the fact that these things can be kind of close together or far apart is somewhat of an inspiring idea to me. And in many ways, I think of my own sensibilities, if I'm to kind of like analyze my own aesthetic, as being, on the one hand, quite classical or romantic, even in terms of the types of expressive goals that I'm after. Mm-hmm. However, the language itself is quite individual, as many composers really of the modern era are. We kind of develop our own systems and our own unique voice and our own language and all of that. But kind of beyond that, if we're developing a voice, well, what do we actually want to say with that voice? And I think that a lot of those things that people articulate end up being archetypal. And I've instead of kind of focusing on the style that those things emerge in, I just find myself drawn to certain composers who seem to kind of articulate the same sort of things that I'm after. And then it's kind of interesting to notice that many of these people pop up at very different times in history with very different languages, yet they all seem to kind of be getting at the same thing. And especially in contrast to other composers at the same time, they seem completely out of place or completely different. And that's why I've been always attracted to music from different eras. Like, I remember really liking, and a lot of this has to do with the things I was introduced to at a young age. Palestrina was an interesting composer, and Josquin Dupré was another who was really interesting for me to come into contact with. I always, again, really was drawn to Beethoven, and Stravinsky was an early model. Tchaikovsky seemed to be a very interesting connection to the, in terms of his raw emotional power. And so, I think of a lot of how my music is working today as, in some ways, trying to express the sentiments that are continuing in a through line throughout history that I seem to belong to, or that I seem to feel attracted to, or seem most closely related to my own aesthetic. And then at the same time, realizing that I'm also very much attracted to so many other things. And so there's a pluralist element to what I do that attempts to bring in all of these influences with the understanding that there is a unified aesthetic in the end. And there's really no point in restating the past. It's really more just an acknowledgement of who I am at the moment, with my own unique voice, but also that I am connected to the rest of history.
I think that's a really great spot to listen to your first piece.
Sure, yeah.
You want to tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, okay. So maybe this would be an interesting place to show my string octet, actually, because if we're talking about how history relates to my own music, this is certainly appropriate. This is a piece called Os Imagis 2, Wide Arc Low in the Northern Sky. And the performance is by the JACK Quartet and the Spektral Quartet, who are forming an octet together. And I composed this piece in 2016. The way that this connects to the conversation is, I suppose, that I use Beethoven quotes throughout. So I guess I'll play this piece and then we can talk about it afterwards.
Sounds great.
Okay.
So you mentioned the influence of Beethoven, and of course you're using these Beethoven quotes. What's the significance of those quotes specifically within the context of this work?
Yeah, so one of the reasons that I've been attracted to Beethoven throughout the years is I think that often something that is misunderstood about him, let's say, or his music even more so, is it has this very alive quality to it. It has this intensely, especially in his later works, I think. It begins in the middle period and kind of extends out into his later works. You get the sense of each of the musical figurations that he uses take on a certain character. And I experience them in my own listening as being these alive entities of sorts. And I think that to connect back to the previous conversation, on how music is connected throughout time, it's a quality that I've also noticed in other pieces throughout history, and another composer who I think maybe does even certainly a different job, but in many ways an even more articulated version of this idea is Sciarrino.
Mm-hmm.
And I really feel, for instance, in Sciarrino's music, like let's say he has this violin concerto, Allegoria della Notte, as well as the Morte di Borromini and Infinito Nero. Each of the musical characters that you get in there really are living and literally breathing in many of these cases. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's a very similar quality that I hear in Beethoven, especially in the later works, because a lot of his language is in many ways formed by this rhetorical style that's really of central focus, at least in the education of the people of that period in time. And also he even himself speaks in some of his letters and things like that of developing a new practice or a new mode of sketching in particular, where he'll really find something which is preserved in its essence in a abstracted form, and then he's able to shift the behavior of that through the piece. And so the way that Beethoven really relates to this piece, it's actually kind of a very direct relationship with the Beethoven and a sort of understated relationship with the Sciarrino in a way, in which the Sciarrino is not necessarily articulated because the modern language that's being used is my own as opposed to his. And I guess the point that I'm trying to make is that contemporary music really can continue along in the same spirit that the Beethoven can. And to juxtapose these things one next to another is to sort of attempt to draw the connection between the two different worlds and link them together.
This would only work because of that stark juxtaposition.
Yeah, I think
you couldn't quote the Sciarrino unless you're quoting the Sciarrino who's quoting the Mendelssohn.
Yeah, exactly.
And then it would be this chain of quotations.
Yeah, and I think that's on the one hand, I'm not really trying to prove that it can be done in Sciarrino's music, because I think people can listen to that for themselves and make their own decisions. I'm really more trying to connect the dots for myself and say that I have a feeling that this is what's happening in Beethoven, this is what's happening in Sciarrino, and it is about the distance between them in time that's really so intriguing to me, and the fact that you can take these abstract musical materials and animate them with a sense of personality, with a sense of living being. And that's really what the piece does. It starts off with this very abstracted musical material that's based on complex numerical systems, which are entirely devoid of personality in their own right, unless articulated in such a way. And so as the piece goes on, that abstract musical material is sort of infused with the responsive wisdom, let's say, of the Beethoven, which is placed in juxtaposition. And so it kind of borrows characteristic elements from the Beethoven, at least in terms of behavioral structuring. Linguistically, only in maybe some nominal places does it borrow very specific kinds of theoretical techniques. Yeah.
But even with those sections that are based on the complex numerical systems, they're not void of expression.
No, they have their own. The point is, they have their own expression. They have their own qualities, which are distinct from something which is completely composed from the ground up, let's say. And what I'm doing is reading into those patterns that are generated by numerical systems and kind of finding within those the aspects which I think are akin to the characteristic aspects of the Beethoven.
Right. What I'm curious, though, is what you would consider to be the opposite of this. What's the opposite of this sort of music that's focused on characterization?
Yeah.
Would it be... I mean, this isn't a qualitative comparison. It's just an
observation.
An observation. It would be what, highly formalist, cold, objective sort of.
Yeah, I think that. So I've written some papers on the subject of mimesis and anthropomorphism, and I actually used the Beethoven quotes, which I used in the in this piece, as the kind of the perfect archetype of, in my view, of characteristic music. I also use Ferneyhough as well, but Beethoven is a really great example, especially the fifth movement of the Opus 131 Quartet, which is the first quote that I use, and to me, kind of a very clear example. What I actually consider to be the complete opposite of this, and I kind of term this as like mimetic versus totally abstract, let's say, is that it has to do with, I think, really, in many cases, total serialism. So I use Pierre Boulez as an example of this because in many ways, I mean, this also connects back to the difference, the distinction between like a voice and a language, is like the language of total serialism really doesn't suggest any sort of character or doesn't deny any sort of character either, but it's really how the parameters are selected in order to evoke something. And I think that the reason that he uses total serialism as a technique is to sort of subvert all of the typical musical elements which would otherwise lend themselves to evoking a sense of character. Like, the one thing that I think makes the Beethoven effective in this way is that there are these rhetorical qualities to them that have to do with self-reference and have to do with repetition of similar motives that are developed slowly throughout time. Whereas if you're composing music which is hinged on the fact that nothing is repeating and that nothing is in reference to anything else, then it really becomes this void of sorts where nothing ever truly forms except for the images or the sensations that your perceptive imagination can kind of map onto them. And so I think of the opposite being something which is actually intentionally the other way around, something which avoids by all means, by all possible associations, something which is dramatic, something which is character-based, something which is in many ways, related back to the canon. And I think of, I don't know that Pierre Boulez would really term any of these things in this way. I just think that that's the function that's served in the context of this discussion. And I think it's something that he also struggles with himself in his own music. I know that, for example, another piece which I think is quite characteristic in its approach is the Turangalila Symphony by Messiaen. And he's kind of famously, found booing at the back of the premiere, I believe it is, of that piece, where he...
Messiaen is?
Yeah. No. Boulez,
I was going to say.
Boulez is booing Messiaen because he thinks that, he thinks that it's really not, doesn't go far enough, it's too traditional in its approach. And I view it the other way around. I think that, like, the Messiaen really... it kind of preserves an element of the tradition which is quite beautiful and quite meaningful, and Boulez sees this as being a retrogressive and something which is really, I think he focuses primarily on the language as opposed to the meaning that's contained within. And then what happens later on in his own career, obviously, is he begins to experiment with more dramatic forms and more less totalitarian control, and he even begins as a conductor to start conducting romantic music, which I think pretty much deeply informs what he's doing. He has great performances of the Janacek, I can't remember which piece it is, some orchestra pieces. And I think he does I think he does Mahler as well, and he does a lot of romantic works that I have to wonder why he is so attracted to those as a conductor, but as a composer seems so fundamentally opposed to them. I think that it is really something where he kind of rejected Messiaen, oddly enough, being his teacher because of the linguistic qualities, and then as he himself progressed throughout his career, he realized that there was something more that he wanted to express. And I don't know that I would ever, I don't think that he ever reached a point where the degree of expression which he reached really matched kind of the true expressive artists of the time or earlier, like Messiaen or Tchaikovsky. But at the very least, the fact that he kind of pursued the opposite direction so rigorously, and then came to the conclusion, in my view, that that there really was something to be saved, I think is actually kind of a profound experiment that was tried in history. And I don't know that other composers reached the same conclusion as he did. So I think that what Boulez did was very valuable in that way. And it opens up a space for me, too, because now I have the ability to move between these spectrums of starting from something which is just pure chaos and has no association and really is kind of cosmic in its understanding of the world, and something which is intimate and which is personality focused and which is something that you can relate to on a very personal and intimate level. I think that those two dimensions are really important things to have in the music, and if you simply have the characteristic, it can very easily become these sort of trite vignettes, where it's just, there is no drama, there is no sense of being in the world. It really is only this abstracted icon that there is no story associated with it.
Sure.
Yeah.
When I think back on Beethoven, I can isolate a few examples where the composer is clearly responding to his environment, or his environment changing.
Yeah.
You can talk about the Eroica, where, originally penned in dedication to Napoleon. You can talk about the Pastoral, where he's, inspired by these different landscapes.
Absolutely. I think Beethoven really responds to his environment a lot.
You are someone who has made this great transition from environments. You grew up in New York City. Now we're currently in the foothills of the Bay Area.
That's right.
How has your music responded to this sort of environment?
Yeah, so this is something that I've thought quite a lot about. I think that I'm kind of a sponge in a lot of ways. I'm a sponge with very many kinships. So I think that I kind of move through the world and absorb the things which seem to speak to me the most. And when I was in New York, I absorbed all the things that were to be found there. And obviously that forms a huge part of my upbringing, because I spent the first 23 years of my life living in New York City. And it was kind of the only world that I knew, aside from, the traveling that I had done. I was always pretty adventurous as a kid. And my parents were also very adventurous people, and I was very fortunate to have them that they took me on a lot of very, very intense trips as a young child. Like, one of my earliest experiences traveling was, I was maybe like 9 years old or something, and I had gone to Europe for the first time with my family, because we went to visit Italy, where my family comes from, and we hiked over the Swiss Alps from Italy into Switzerland. And I went to a nice chocolate factory while I was there, and I remember more of the chocolate factory than I do of the hike through the Alps. But it was one of...
You were a kid in a chocolate factory.
Exactly. And I remember there were lizards on the ground, and I really enjoyed that.
Yeah.
But I there were many other experiences that kind of juxtaposed my existence growing up in New York. Like, when I was maybe 8 years old or something like that, I hiked to the top of Mount Washington, which is, several thousand feet up, and spent the night in this wind-powered cabin, like up in the clouds. And I think all of those things formed these really poignant moments in my childhood that I don't think I really got to truly explore until I came out to California, because I found myself living not just kind of in a city which was surrounded by, like in New York City, it's like you're in the city. There's no other world that exists outside of that, except for the rare things where you have to dramatically remove yourself from the situation and go off and experience something. I found it kind of reversed in a way when I came out to California. I drove with my father, actually, when I moved out here. And the first experience I had was coming over the border and being in Paradise. And I thought, this place is great. It's like all of the...
This is the border to California.
The border of California, yeah. It's like this is the... this place is paradise. And it really is kind of a full unfolding of all of the childhood experiences I've had of like being in the wild, which, I had enough of to really kind of gain a sense and appreciation of, but it was undeveloped because I hadn't lived in it, And so when I came to the Bay Area, my first experience was that this was this small little Silicon Valley, tech bubble that was within this much larger wilderness. And so, whereas other people might kind of view it the other way around, that was the perspective that I came to things with. And to kind of speak also about, the survival through the doctoral program, let's say, it was really the thing that kind of got me through in a way, because I reached a point somewhere in the middle of my degree where I was really kind of just living in the city, in my own mind. And I needed to escape that in some way and really connect it to the larger story of why I was out here. And
there was an incongruency. Yeah. You clearly were no longer in the city, and you hadn't been in the city for a while.
Yeah.
But you still maintained the same sort of logic.
Yeah, absolutely. I had experienced all of these things on this amazing trip across the country, and I found myself in my own mind very much the same person that I was when I left New York. But really there was all of these things bubbling up inside that I had not yet addressed, because I was just so focused on composing at the time, and so focused on in some way maintaining the same sort of compositional language that I had developed when I was still living in New York.
Is that important to you?
It was the time to maintain that language, but I think that what became more important to me was understanding that the sense of place that I inhabit actually really does and should inform my music practice, because to not acknowledge that would be to delude myself of the fact that I have learned many things, I have experienced many things. And if I'm often drawing from my own personal experiences to guide myself through a composition, how could I possibly ignore this huge dramatic change in my life?
Sure.
And so I ended up kind of actually in this octet was probably one of the first times where I said, I really need to put aside my previous life in a way and develop something which I think is dramatically different, or at the very least doesn't rely on the same patterns of thought that I had done before. That's why I used the numerical system in the first place, is it allowed me to give it allowed me to read into something new. And in the end, what I found was that much of my sensibilities remained actually exactly the same. So there were some things that were very consistent throughout, and there were other things which I was just holding on to because I thought I had to. And in order to really open that up to see what things could be gained from a change in environment, and which things were truly, relating to myself, that were more unique to me and really not just kind of things borrowed or perceived in the environment, I kind of threw myself out into that first experience that I had in California and said, I'm going to try and just for a bit of a time remove myself from society to whatever degree I can delude myself into doing that,
This is right when you started going on these recording walks.
Yeah. Well, I remember I had a very kind of understated sort of life-changing experience one day where I was composing a piece for the Distractfold ensemble in the UK. And I remember kind of walking on the Stanford campus out to Lake Lagunita, which is like this drained basin that is kind of wild. It's like a very wild sort of area on the Stanford campus. And I walked back into this stream where there's a stream that kind of flows through these two trees that are one side of the other in this tiny little grotto of sorts. And I was kind of standing out there and listening, and I realized that there were these birds that were just kind of, and insects that were singing in this counterpoint with each other, and that it was very musical to my ears. And I kind of listened to it for a while, and I thought, that's really interesting. What if I recorded that? Or what if I just tried to find things like that for my own appreciation? And I recalled a lesson that I had with my former teacher, Du Yun, when I was at the SUNY Purchase Conservatory in New York, where I was kind of bringing in a string quintet, and it was some of the music was meant to evoke natural imagery. And she said to me, why don't you just do what you want to do? Like, why do you have to bring this about through the music? Why can't you just have the sounds that you are trying to convey? And I didn't really confront that until I had articulated something which I thought, this is something that I can actually use, or I can actually capture, I can actually have a relationship to. And so I spent the next several years really just, especially that year, which was, I believe, the third year that I was in my degree.
Third year at the DMA at Stanford.
That's right. Mm-hmm. I spent a lot of that time really not composing very much at all. I composed a lot earlier in the year, and then in the spring I kind of really needed a break from myself in a way. And so I went, I spent many months and many hours out in the field, first to explore the sensation of that musical quality to natural sound. And then I began recording it because I wanted to capture it for myself. I wanted to document it. And then I began to incorporate it as part of my music, because in the end I had to come to terms with the fact that I'm not necessarily a documentarian. I'm not an activist. I'm a musician and I'm an artist, and my true strength lies in the ability to make things musically rather than to simply try to incorporate a different practice. And I have kind of learned other practices so that they may be incorporated, let's say, or because I found them interesting to a certain point. But in the end, it always ended up leading back into music.
I feel like this process in reflecting on your newfound environment over time is something that I see as a process.
Yeah.
And if you look at a lot of composers who have a real genuine transition, it takes time.
Oh, yeah.
Whereas often people think that, he moved and then the first piece that he wrote in California, he was a new man. Like, that's not how it works. It takes time to really digest creatively and aesthetically how this new environment is going to be reflected in your music now.
Yeah, and
what sort of opinions do you have? You can't have an opinion. I mean, yes, you can have an opinion right away, but
you have to do something.
You need to digest it.
Well, that's like if you don't, for example, if you don't write a piece, or if you write a piece and it's not working, what's the reason for that? Yeah. For me, it was like I had to digest it by writing pieces that didn't seem to fit.
Yeah.
I wrote a couple of pieces when I first read at Stanford that, like I said, were in a previous life. They were something that they were relevant to me months before, and I was still holding on to something which was no longer true to me.
Sure.
And it was academic maybe, or stale, or I don't know that academic is even really the word. It was just struggling a little bit with coming to terms with a lot of these things. And I think that I wouldn't have been able to come to a conclusion about how I wanted to move forward had I not just said, okay, I'm going to try myself first.
Sure.
How I thought I was, and then kind of observe how this just doesn't feel quite right. How do I adapt myself to make sure that the next piece, let's say, is closer to who I feel I should be, or closer to how my music reflects who I am.
Yeah. I feel as though maybe my bigger like a compositional transition within my practice happened immediately before Stanford. However, I would also point to my third year as the point where my environment is encroaching on my practice.
Yeah. Well, how so?
My third year, I wrote the trombone duo, where I'm starting to really process language. I'm creating these augmented instruments. The innovation-obsessed culture of Silicon Valley is becoming inescapable.
Yeah,
and I need to address it. It's not something that's like entirely positive or negative in my mind, but it is something that I felt after living here for 2.5, 3 years. I needed to have my own spin on it.
Well, you can't shut it out, because if you shut it out, then you're shrinking down to this, to a perspective which does not promote creativity.
Yeah.
It's something where you don't contend with anything. You just, in a vacuum, compose abstract thoughts that are the limits of your own imagination.
Right.
And if you do that, you'll find that your imagination is quite limited without some stimulus.
Right. And also, for as much as I sometimes view myself as this monk in a cloister, just isolated from the rest of the world, I am part of the rest of the world. Like
a cloister is part of the rest of the world, right?
Yeah, I'm existing in a society. I have interactions with that society, however rare they may be.
Yeah. Well, especially when you have a deadline, then you're
exactly.
Then you're in there. But
right.
You're out in the world primarily, in fact, and then you seclude yourself, you isolate yourself, so that you can kind of get it all out, But it's not like you spend 100% of your time in a closet and then, There
have been times.
Yeah, yes, yeah, for all of us, yeah. But, you have to rely on the experiences that you have out in the world to kind of inform your imagination, I think, when you are secluded, when you are in isolation.
Right.
And that's why, for me, I feel like I'm a musical camel of sorts, like a adventurous camel, where I go out and have these experiences that sort of sustain me or provide me with some sort of inspiration or I don't know that inspiration is even the right word.
But I think these anecdotes are really getting at a great misconception. They're hopefully dispelling this misconception that composers, they sit under a tree and they're inspired and then they write. Like, it's often not this direct cause and effect. They might have these experiences and then they get processed over the next 2, 3, 5, 10 years.
Yeah. Or never. They could
or
also
rare,
be never addressed.
Right.
And I think that's a shame.
It's not like, American who goes to Paris, sees the Eiffel Tower, feels inspired and writes some romantic music. Yeah. Like, no, that's not how it works.
No, I think it's more, I think it's deeper than that, because, I mean, what exactly about that experience would transform your thought process,
Right.
So, for example, I think that walking in the woods, walking in the forest actually is part of my process in a certain way, but not in the same way where it's like, I feel so great that I just went for a walk, and now I'm going to go write about how I feel about it.
Sure.
It's more that, like, I think when you're in the wild, it's a really good measure of your own perception and of your own decision making, because you're now in a place where your decisions inform if you're going to survive or not, or if you're going to, or even just like basic elemental things about being alive. Do I want to take the left path or do I want to take the right path? Do I want to take the shortcut through this area or do I want to take the long way around? And all of those sorts of things are very performative in a very basic way. And when it comes down to sitting down and composing something and making a decision, am I going to go left, am I going to go right? You kind of draw upon the decisions that you've made previously as a means of judging whether or not they are good decisions in the first place.
Do you want to confront the familiar? Do you want to go an unknown path?
Exactly. And I think of those experiences as directly part of the compositional process in a way. They're not serving the compositional process, but they certainly inform it. And in some ways, I use it as a tool,
Sure.
Sometimes before, and this is something that I did before I even moved out to California, is when I was living at SUNY Purchase in New York, we were surrounded by woods on all sides. So if I was ever at a point where I felt like, I don't really know what I'm doing right now, I'm just going to go out for a walk and clear my head, I would just go walk in the woods until until there were no other distractions other than the things that were around me, and I could just perceive things as they were, think about things, and sort them out. And the same sort of thing I think is still relevant. But yeah, like you say...
It's a well-documented practice
Yeah.
for different figures throughout history. You talk about Darwin going on these daily walks to clear his mind, or probably Beethoven as well.
All of them. I mean, I think one person who I reference sometimes in this discussion is Wagner. I mean, he's a bit more of a... He has a bit more of a problem with his perspective because he's very German-centric, you know, like he has this great letter, I think it's like Letter on Music addressed to the French, where he basically describes the sensation of listening to natural sound, where as you are removing yourself from the noise of the city, he says there's an increasingly eloquent silence that emerges, and you start to attune your hearing to the voices of the wild, which become more clear as your sense of hearing gets attuned. And then eventually he kind of goes on to say that, you know, if you were to extract one of these singers' birds from the forest, let's say, that what would you get? It would really not be a worthwhile endeavor for you because it would be something more akin to a song in the Italian style. So, you know, he really does...
you have to take his things...
Well, exactly.
Yeah.
I think that his perspective on how the psychology of your mind unfolds in nature is quite profound and quite true. And then the way that he places that aesthetic in relation to nationalism is wrong. You know, it's something where like, yeah, I mean, it's very deep until you start to kind of, you know, make fun of the Italians. And in your letter to the French, of course, you know, it's like, of course, German style is going to be the most the most worthwhile thing to you. But at the very, you know, that's besides the point. I don't think that you have to cast aside his very real observations just because he has an opinion about it after the fact, you know, and yeah.
Well, I think this is a great point, especially with our sort of naturalistic discussion, to listen to some more music.
Yeah. Well, actually, I think maybe I'll share just a field recording because that'll give a little bit of context of the type of music that's incorporated into these sorts of worlds. Yeah.
So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your compositional process. I imagine it changes quite a bit depending on if you're writing for a purely acoustic ensemble versus some of your more recent works where you're implementing these field recordings within an ensemble context.
Well, I think that, first of all, as I said, if I'm confronting something new, let's say, that there are certain things about the process that remain entirely the same. Some things that are just, regardless of what my perspective is kind of latched onto, I prefer to frame things in a certain way. A phrasing is more related to the language which I feel best expresses what I'm trying to get at, regardless of the particular entity or character, let's say, that's being evoked, if you want to think of it that way. And then there are other things where actually the external existence of something within the work implies its own trajectory, which then I explore because of the fact that it needs to be integrated in some way. So if I'm speaking about purely abstract music, let's say, or something which is, maybe that's not the best way to put it. If I'm speaking about something that is not in relation to a direct use of field recording, let's say, often I will still derive musical material from external objects or sources that are not directly represented themselves in the music, meaning that they're not recordings of the phenomena which I'm representing. So, for example, in the string octet that I played, I use imagery that comes from William Carlos Williams. And so a lot of the movements of that, while they are orchestrations of a rhythmic framework that's generated numerically, the thing that's being represented using that as a mechanism is imagery which is combined from different sources within William Carlos Williams' poetry. So in that sense, I do seem to, in many cases, still rely on something external as a means of expressing something which I feel I have some relationship to. There are other pieces, though, that are entirely derived from what I think sounds good, that have nothing to do with a concept. And then there are pieces that, again, use a direct relationship by providing, as my teacher Du Yun said, just do the thing that you want to do. Just put in the thing that you're actually trying to represent and have that represent itself, as opposed to you trying to make a point by bringing something alive that already is alive,
So is this entry point usually, okay, so you're reading a poem or you're looking at a landscape, or are you jotting down notes? By notes, I mean like prose to remind yourself of what you're trying to achieve, or are you starting out with just a compositional sketch?
It begins in a variety of ways, because I think that I don't ever seek out with a single goal. I don't think that it's ever my goal to kind of be like, I would like to represent this as a landscape, or I would like to represent this landscape. I would like to show this particular thing. I think each of the pieces that I have is in some ways trying to explore several things all at the same time. And so it could be the case that I begin with an experiment where I say, I want to create a fractal form. I want to, let's say in the case of the numerical pieces that I write, I want to begin by using a rhythmic sequence which has 10 different values in them. That is the means for me to then find something within. And then, after I extend that sequence to a certain distance, then I can find shapes within that I think are interesting in a musical sort of sense. And then, well, okay, how do I want to represent, what do I want to do with this now that it's done? I can then draw upon my own experiences, maybe things that have been jotted down, maybe things that I've photographed, or maybe things that I just remember that seem to me to reflect the form which has emerged as an abstract construct. And often, I will pursue a dramatic form because I think that it reflects several different experiences all at the same time. and I might articulate this to myself very clearly. I might just kind of do it because I have a feeling that it'll work out in some sort of way. And then in a sort of performative sense, I'll do these things without necessarily knowing exactly where it's going to end up, but sort of pursuing it because it has a pull to it. And then what's the best match for that? What are the things that seem to suggest themselves as the most appropriate expression of this larger ideal, of this larger experience, of this larger expression that's coming forth? And I see a lot of what I do as kind of trying to kind of satisfy both an aesthetic agenda as well as an expressive agenda, and finding which of those things match best together.
And how early does a title come into play?
So it varies.
Really?
For example, the octet that I shared, Ozy Magis 2, that is something which is actually a sequel, obviously, to an earlier piece. So that title was really more about evoking images from poetry rather than anything. And then the subtitle to that, Wide Arc Low in the Northern Sky, is taken from an image in William Carlos Williams' The Storm, where he describes a rainbow. And so in that sense, I knew that a rainbow was a central image in the poem, and I had a feeling that it would, because it was a central image, because it suggested itself to me as a strong image, it would be some sort of point of focus in the piece that I would then compose.
Right, and that's the score where you're also using these colored circles to represent the different cycles. Yeah, and I chose the amount of cycles, which were 8, based on the fact that there were 8 instruments within the octet, so I could distribute the rhythms with 1 per each. And also, I included the colors because they enabled me to organize the distribution of the instrumental techniques and distribution of the rhythms throughout. And they had a conceptual double meaning by organizing it based on color. I could have 8 different colors, 1 for each of the rainbow, as well as black, which to me was a kind of like the alien figure throughout that provided me the certain degree of flexibility that I could insert figuration, for example, that would not just be a pure representation of a rainbow or something like that. It's like, the rainbow is like an expressive tool that carries with it some character, which is, again, kind of tying back to the Beethoven. Then there are other pieces like the piece that I wrote for Distractfold, which is called 6 Silver Rings of Aquamarine. And I actually just began with the title of that. I thought that it was something about aquamarine. It just seemed like an interesting, what's the word for it? A synesthetic sense, something about the quality of a color as a texture, and I wanted to really more represent the softness of that color in a way, the delicacy. Really?
Yeah.
And I felt like that was a very aggressive work.
Well, that's because the aquamarine section is a tape part, which is actually something that's yet to be recorded yet, but it's for a solo flute with glissando head joint and Kingma system, as well as 7 recorded flutes from the same flutist. It's a commission from the flutist Rachel Hacker, who's down at CalArts now. And that piece is meant to be encased within the 6 silver rings, where that piece was really viewed as like a mechanistic encasement of this more impressionistic centerpiece. And so the 6 silver rings aspect of it really is a very structural idea, and comes from a book that I was reading about cyclic forms of storytelling that have to do with, so if you have like a story that has an arc to it, you can have several arcs which will correspond over the course of a piece symmetrically. So if you begin with a certain image, let's say, then the last image of a movie or television show or something will be an inversion dramatically of that image. And then the second image will be an inversion of the penultimate image, this sort of thing. And if you kind of follow that through, there's a centerpiece which is considered to be the dramatic climax. And so I wanted to explore that as a means of kind of encasing things and exploring how to weight dramatically different sorts of materials in different places. And then, others, I get a sense that this title itself suggests some sort of thing that I'm pretty much after. It's a complex image of sorts that I need to then investigate. So it's a representation in and of itself of the music which I know I'm going to explore.
Mm-hmm. And
I think oftentimes those titles remain, even if I've kind of pursued it into a different direction. I think it's important to keep that venue open to yourself. Otherwise, you end up composing to a standard which could be dissonant with how the music itself is functioning on a purely musical level, a purely sonic level.
Sure. Yeah, oftentimes you start composing and the music suggests itself to follow up in a certain direction.
Yeah.
That may not be the same direction as the title.
Yeah, and I've learned that lesson before.
Trying to force music in some other direction that it's not being suggested, it could be very bad.
Yeah, I mean, I think that on the one hand, I think I began with that mismatch as a challenge, by saying there's this material which it's abstract and interesting in its own right, but then it's kind of paired with this concept that seems to force its behavior in one direction or another.
I think we've all run into this mismatch of you develop material, but then you have a concept, and sometimes the material doesn't support the concept.
Yeah.
And we just try to force it that way. And
you can in some ways, in some cases, actually you find that there is a match, and that's actually very exciting.
Sure.
That's really what I'm after. But in many cases, it ends up being that the fundamental decision that you made at the very beginning of the piece was flawed.
Yeah.
And you can spend the rest of the composition of the piece trying to hammer a square peg into a circle hole, and you might actually succeed, but it might not be a good piece.
Yeah, exactly.
Or it's compromised in some way.
Yeah.
It would have been better suited if you had just followed the instinct that you had. And I think it's actually just like a weird decision that people make in general, that composers make in general, which is that why should that one decision determine the rest of the piece? Why should that single moment be the thing that you rely on because it's really you can zoom it into one decision. It's something that at one point or another you said, yeah, I think I'm going to go this way, versus if you zoom into another decision, it's well, this could be a G, this could be a G sharp, could go either way, and then you make it a G, and then you're like, nah, I think this will be a G sharp instead. And it's that degree of flexibility, I think, is something that should also be applied to the formal level, and I think actually needs to, in some way, be addressed retrospectively if you are developing material that has its own sense.
Sure.
And I think that the titles of pieces can also reflect that. Although, I think that we as composers we seem to have a greater sense of attachment to the titles that we create. For whatever reason. Maybe they are guiding us forward with how we
You need something material. To get over the blank page.
Yeah.
And a title is at least one step in the direction of it being finished.
Well, it's something that can enable the orientation of your decision making.
Yeah.
It can also inhibit it,
Definitely.
But you do need something, a title, if you have a title as compared to nothing is a good move.
Yeah.
But also a phrase or a harmony or anything, I think, is equally serving as a foundation to build on something. I think the danger with any of those things is that we become too attached and too obsessed with the mechanism that we've created, or with the concept that we've created, that it begins to blot out all of the nuances of how the music is actually functioning in the end. And I think really all of these things actually should be in service of the sound. So if there is nothing, if whatever the concept that you were kind of holding on to, or the aspect that you began with, is preventing you from moving forward, then you actually, it's actually not serving the purpose that you thought it was, right? You thought that it was helping you forward, but maybe it was helping you forward for a certain point, and then you had to adapt,
Sure.
And I think that's totally necessary to do.
We've spoken a bit about the extra musical qualities. Do you have any parallel artistic practices?
Well, I mean, there's the field recording practice for sure.
Although I would venture to say that's no longer a parallel practice. That's a central part of your practice.
Yeah. I think it began as a parallel practice, something which I felt was related because it used my musical sensibility to be able to distinguish sounds in natural soundscapes. But because it's been over time applied in a variety of contexts, it remains in some ways a parallel practice because I document things purely for their own sake.
It all comes back to the fact that composers can't have hobbies.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, exactly. Everything just consumed by composition. Yeah,
exactly.
So yeah, in the end, it ends up being like a compositional thing, which in very many ways it's similar to the numerical stuff because it started off as a way to free myself from the previous perspective that I had, and then it ended up being something which became a new articulation of the thing which I had left behind. So there's that. I mean, I've always been a guitarist, you know. I've been playing less in recent years because I've been more focused on composition, but it's something I'm coming back to a little bit. I think it's a very immediate thing that I feel no pressure to academicize. I studied the guitar for a few years in college, for 1 year actually, where I was, very much in spirit a rock and heavy metal guitarist, yet I realized that the only places that would allow me to study guitar were jazz-oriented programs. So I studied jazz guitar for a while and, found that it was killing my passion for the instrument. And so I decided I'm just going to keep this for myself. This is going to be something that I can use however I want, and I don't want to feel like I have to do this or I have to practice or I have to play in a certain way. Sure. And so you could view that as a kind of parallel practice also. Again, it's all in service of composition. The reason that I picked up the guitar in the first place is because I wanted to make weird tape pieces or I don't know if that's really the reason, but what I ended up doing almost immediately after I picked up the guitar was to start composing with it, so yeah.
Well, I think this leads into one of the questions that we always talk about, which is how are you presenting yourself to non-musicians? Yeah.
Well, actually, the field recording practice has been a really interesting means of testing this sort of thing out because on the one hand, I find myself in the realm of ecology, and so I've spoken at environmentalist conferences and climate change conferences and this sort of thing. And so I find that, I have to frame things in a lay person's perspective when I'm doing this, and I have to share these things in a way that's immediately perceptible to people who are not technically oriented in that world. And I myself am not so technically oriented in that world. So I have to kind of consider it that way. How that relates to composition is, I think that at the very core of what I'm trying to accomplish in my music is something which is both aesthetically sophisticated, as I kind of am alluding to, and something which has a raw immediacy of power. So something which has the linguistic capabilities of Beethoven, let's say, but also has the punch of Metallica, And so...
so do you say that?
No. I mean, I'll say it here.
I have the raw aestheticness of Beethoven and the punch of Metallica.
No, I would say that those are the things that which have spoken to me in those two realms most early on that have
you'll just end up with a very confused audience.
Yeah, they're just profoundly confused. Yeah. But I don't know. I think that I'm not intending to kind of provide a clear, point of reference for anybody. It's more that those are the things that first articulated those meta sensibilities that if I'm to describe them myself, those were where I would trace them back to. And I think if I'm allowing the music to present itself to people, those are the things that I hope come across the most, is that there is some sort of sophisticated design which is slightly or to some degree beyond comprehension in the immediacy of performance. However, there is some sort of emotional or expressive immediacy which is not necessarily reliant upon the sophistication of the language to fully grasp. So we're not fully grasp, but to grasp at all. So you have this sense of something which you can really understand, which is just beyond your level of comprehension. And so that's what I'm aiming for in some ways aesthetically. How I talk about this to other people, I mean, it's always been kind of it's always been like a challenge because
It's one of the greatest challenges that we face.
yeah, because I mean, all of us. It's not like we live in this world where we're just bumping into composers left and right.
Exactly.
Like all of my family members are non-musicians. All of my friends growing up in the neighborhood are non-musicians, and so I play. When I was growing up, when I was in high school, I had this friend who I would constantly. He was a guitar player also, but he was kind of more casually, doing it. But he liked the music that I was writing, and so I would show it to him and just kind of ask him what he thought and stuff. And I show him the music that I write today with the exact same presentation as I show the music that I was writing back then, which is just more like, okay, well, he's not going to understand anything that I say in relation to this, so I'm just going to have him listen to it, and if he asks questions, then I'll answer the questions. And I find that is a good way of dealing with it because it doesn't presume interest on the other person's part. It kind of presents the thing with all its mystery and all its intrigue and hopefully intrigue, all of its things that if they call to a particular person, they can ask the questions which are more important to them. And yeah, I think that it's important to represent those things.
It can be tricky.
Actually, non-academically, yeah.
Yeah, sometimes composers, I feel, provide too much preface.
That's because they think they think that they have to. On the one hand, they also maybe they've been so focused on the preface themselves that they've lost track of what the music is actually doing.
It could be. It feels to me as though they're forcing a perspective.
Yeah.
Where they feel, oh, this person isn't going to understand it, so let me like hold their hand and walk them through.
I disagree with that approach altogether.
Sometimes some context can be really helpful just to provide like an initial entry point into a new work. Oh,
absolutely, yeah.
But other than that, I don't want to be forcing a particular perspective. If they come away thinking the piece is about something that I strongly disagree with, that's totally fine.
It also speaks to the nature of the music. So, for example, if there's and this is kind of like a war of the romantics sort of topic, which is to say that just because something is abstract doesn't mean that it doesn't suggest its own program of sorts, or its own narrative is a better way of thinking of it. Like when I listen to Beethoven, again, coming back to Beethoven,
it's the man of the hour.
That's right, the abstract quality of his music, for example, to take the Opus 131 quartet, it is entirely an abstract narrative to me. Like I really perceive it as a narrative with moments where it devolves into instrumental bliss, and I think that that's a really beautiful sort of thing because you as the listener imagine your way to that narrative, and he provides the prism by which you can filter your perceptive light through, and kind of make something happen. And then there are other pieces where they aim to do the same thing, but in a very articulated sort of way, and the concept is a very direct image. So like there's the Alpine Symphony by Strauss, for example, which is actually a brilliant representation of the imagery that he's choosing to represent. However, it's so focused and so particular that it requires that degree of preface to make any sense of it, because of the fact that so many of the decisions that kind of come from it would make less sense if without provided that context. Yeah.
Well, what do you think of Beethoven as a modern icon? I bring this up because I was in Los Angeles last week, and I had parked in downtown LA in this subterranean parking garage.
Yeah.
And upon emerging to the surface level, I found myself in this park in the center of Los Angeles in the downtown area. And I also found myself confronted with a 10-foot tall statue of Beethoven. And
10 feet's a bit much.
there didn't seem to be any clear explanation about why this Beethoven statue is in this downtown LA park. I also happen to live about a block or so away from Golden Gate Park in San Francisco, where there's also a statue of Beethoven.
Okay. There's also one at the NEC, right?
At the New England Conservatory,
yeah, right.
There's a large looming statue of Beethoven at Jordan Hall. Beethoven died 200 years ago. I'm not really sure. I mean, of course, you can talk about more abstract intellectual notions in his music that could be reflected in downtown Los Angeles. But
because of the fact that what he does in so many cases is non-programmatic, it is universal because you can map your perception onto it, which is the case with much music. Yeah.
I feel like he's being used in these scenarios as a proxy for art. He's a figure. Yeah. He represents human artistic achievement.
I think he's wholly misrepresented in that way. I think that it's been blown completely out of proportion because of the fact that people misunderstand him. And I think that it's a shame because I think he actually should retain that stature, but just for different qualities.
Sure.
Like for...
I'll quickly say I wasn't offended.
Sure.
If anything, I was pleasantly surprised, albeit confused.
Yeah.
So.
Well, yeah, I guess the confusion is kind of the point, right? Is that, on some level that it's deserved, but you don't think that, it's done with the right mentality or something. And
what you said makes sense. It feels misplaced.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is misplaced. And I think it actually is damaging not just to Beethoven, but also to, not to Beethoven himself, obviously, but to our perception of music in general. Because I think that any sort of misrepresentation or confusion actually serves to undermine the true purpose of what something is. So, if there is, if you tell me, for example, Beethoven is the greatest artist who ever lived, and then you give me a poor representation of his music, I'll think, oh, it was totally blown out of proportion. No one, it was just,
wrote any good
it
music.
Wasn't that good to begin with. You know what I mean? Yeah. And then, but actually, it was exactly as good as you said it was, but because you didn't understand why it was so good, you didn't represent it properly. And then it actually damages our ability, or our society's understanding of the potential of music, let's say. And I guess that's another reason why I do use the Beethoven quotes in the octet, is because, it's kind of like, that's my perspective on Beethoven. It's
sure.
I think it's worth sharing. I don't think that, I think I could say that. I think I could show it also. Mm-hmm. For me, it was something which I needed to do for myself musically. But I do feel that way about more than just Beethoven, about a lot of other figures. I had actually this really wonderful experience when I was in Vienna several years ago, where I went to visit one of Beethoven's homes, and there's the original death mask of Beethoven in that house. And you can see one of his pianos is in there, and it's the place where he composed in his middle period, I think between the 4th and the 6th symphony, which are some of my favorite works, the 5th and the 6th in particular.
Sure.
And it's different to look at the face of the man with all of its cracks and wrinkles and the intensity of this person at his death,
right.
Versus a statue, which is a representation of something entirely different.
He was a relatively short person. To be represented as a 10-foot statue.
Yeah, he probably doesn't need to be 10 feet tall, And also, I don't know that it really needs a statue at all. It's, I think that it's probably okay if you just play some of the quartets, some of the symphonies, or any of the pieces that speak to anybody, and you do a really good job of it, as opposed to kind of you enter into NEC, New England Conservatory, for the first time, and the first thing you encounter is the looming figure of Beethoven, and someone just tells you, oh, he was really good, It's kind of you kind of have to know why.
Oh, so you're a composition student?
Yeah.
Okay. So measure up to this guy.
That's right. That old cliche of they have the little skull of the little head figure of Beethoven that they rest on the piano.
Oh yeah.
And he's kind of watching you as you're making all
I have
the decisions.
one of those of Johann Sebastian Bach.
Yeah.
I don't have a piano in my apartment, so he's just next to my computer.
What does that do for you? What is the Bach?
I don't know. I'm not one to adorn an apartment with things, so I figured it's the most ornamental thing I could find.
Yeah, well, and then it's more just kind of a nice thing to have, as opposed to a guiding light or
Exactly.
something.
Fortunately, it's not as though I'm feeling the long shadow of history through this Johann Sebastian Bach bust.
Yeah, and I also don't think that Bach really directly informs your music in any...
No.
Yeah.
I mean, of course, I can draw parallels between his obsession over counterpoint and certain counterpoint-like gestures in my music, but I'm not thinking about Bach all the time.
But you're not like... You don't come to a point in your piece where you go...
What would Bach do?
Yeah. You just stare longingly over to your miniature Bach statue and you go, I just need something from you now. You know, it's that time,
Sebastian.
Yeah. I mean,
Talk to me.
Honestly, even if you did that, I'd be interested to hear why. Because sometimes, not necessarily that I'll go out and I'll, if I'm going out on a walk and I'm trying to sort something out, I will think about pieces which achieved the effect that I, in some way, am going for.
Right.
Or even just like in a composition lesson, if I'm teaching or if I'm being taught, I'm suggested pieces to listen to constantly.
Sure.
And I think it has something to do with representation, the fact that you can prove that something works.
But those pieces are then processed through your own perspective and your own language. It's very rarely that obvious. So
sure.
in this hypothetical scenario, if I had arrived at a certain section in a new work that I'm composing, and then I longingly looked over at this Bach statue, once I finished the work, you probably wouldn't be like, that's the spot. There's a Bach chorale right there.
No.
No.
And honestly, if that's what happened, then I'd be like, that's not a good piece. That's a piece that...
He's really getting lazy.
It really is just kind of like, it could be anything.
Sure.
It could be anything.
Yeah. I think this is a great spot to listen to your final selection.
Yeah, okay. So this is a recording from the TAK Ensemble of my piece Phoenix, which is one of my more recent pieces. It is based on the epic poem from the 12th century by Farid ud-Din Attar, who's a Persian poet. And it's called The Conference of the Birds. And so this poem is essentially a very long allegory for death, rebirth, the pursuit of enlightenment, and as an allegory, kind of a set of paths that one can explore to kind of unlock different aspects of being. So the birds are themselves kind of aspects of humanity that, as they travel across the world in search of the what's called the Simorg, which is the king of all birds, they lose many of their number along the way. And it's kind of a representation of how, in order to pursue an ideal such as enlightenment, you have to sacrifice many things to get there. And I was drawn to this on the one hand because it's does use birds as its central image, and birds themselves are both aesthetic creatures in their songs as well as communicative. And also it's something that comes through in my field recording practice in a lot of ways. But also because it suggests a deeper meaning. It suggests a representation that moves beyond merely the image of the bird. And so, this is kind of a song, actually, because it's a piece which was dispersed within a larger work called Chilnawalna, which is a chamber orchestra piece for Ensemble Dal Niente. And it's meant to be kind of a purely musical representation of this journey which I undertook myself, which then is understood as maybe as kind of viewing music itself as like the voice of humanity, which can coexist with other natural sounds. This is in some ways related to maybe the final movement of the Mahler's Fourth Symphony, where he uses voice after the symphony, and a lot of references to music itself are made, like Saint Cecilia is invoked, who is the patron saint of music, for example. So it's quite different than that piece, obviously, but it really is itself, in a way, kind of about music and for the sake of music, and that's then placed in a larger context.
Okay, let's have a listen.
Great.
Who would retrace this trail? This
So when did you finish this work?
I finished composing this piece in January 2019, and it was a very intense writing process because, like as I mentioned, it really was an encapsulation of, or a capture of whatever sort of came out as I myself was reading through the book and doing my very best to kind of confront each of these aspects of humanity that are kind of laid out as this process for living through. And it was a very intense experience. I have to say, I didn't necessarily know what I was getting myself into and found it to be a very, very deep and challenging introspective journey. I composed the piece also in a number of locations, which I think, to tie back to the previous conversation on how space informs music, made it a very kind of colorful experience for me in a way, or dramatically forcing me to really find my individual self within a variety of places. Like, for example, I started composing the piece here in Woodside in California, and then I continued in New York when I was back there in the winter. I went to Vermont, and I was composing in Vermont for a while, in the Green Mountains.
It maintains a very singular quality, though.
Well, that's kind of the point, right?
Yeah.
Like, going through California, New York, I was in Pennsylvania,
Yeah.
I was in Vermont,
Right.
and then I also kind of wrapped up the piece when I was in Graz in Austria. I think,
It's not this direct cause and effect, as we had already identified.
No, it's more of the fact that despite being in many locations, I am still the same person, And if it really is about kind of cutting to the center or to the essence of something, then it's the sense of self, which is kind of the thing that's articulated, as opposed to a representation of the context in which that self exists. And in that way, you can view this piece as that essence, which is placed in the larger context of Chil Nualna, the Dal Niente piece.
So you had finished this TAK Ensemble piece.
Yeah.
Immediately pivoted and threw yourself into the Dal Niente piece.
Yeah.
Then you defended.
Mm-hmm.
Are you going to be taking a little bit of a break, or you have another project lined up?
I'm trying to take a break a little bit.
Okay.
I'm going to do some field recordings.
Uh-huh.
Because it's the perfect time of year to do that, for one, here in California. But also because it's a very different mode of approaching making art. It's something which is receptive rather than creative, necessarily. And I think it's also something very active at the same time, so it's a very different process. But I do have on the horizon some things I'm looking forward to creatively, compositionally. The next piece that I'd like to compose would be really like a palate cleanser of sorts, because the Phoenix Quintet was very intense to write. So was Chil Nualna, particularly because it was such a large piece, like a large instrumental ensemble that was also using electronics and two voices and two different texts and a lot of different elements all weaved into a singular sort of thing. So in that sense, it was both ambitious and complex at the same time. And I would like to do something that is a bit more essential and refined and on a smaller scale. I have a good friend of mine who's a cellist who lives and works in New York City, and we've been talking about writing a piece together for some time. So I told her maybe I'll just compose like a very short little palate cleanser, something that's like a very conversational piece between the two of us, very intimate in comparison. So I would like to do a nice short cello piece. I've been kind of loosely talking with a few performers and that I've kind of met along the way to do some other pieces as well. A longer cello work, for example, a solo cello work, even maybe a solo bass piece. And I was also actually in conversation with a librettist recently who approached me after the premiere of the Chil Nualna, the Dal Niente piece. And I'm not really sure where that would go, because I've used text in a variety of my works, but they've all been derived from a personal history. That, like, I composed this piece for the Ekmeles Vocal Ensemble that was their vocal sextet, where I used film from my great uncle's personal collection, as well as a text written by my father. And then Chil Nualna used text that was transcribed from a monologue that my brother kind of spontaneously made. So I've never actually used text in a dramatic sense that was used as a narrative, let's say, that wasn't personally derived. And obviously I've used text that's been comes mostly from poetry in a lot of other cases. But yeah, the idea of kind of doing something dramatic which comes from an original sense of story, or collaborates with somebody else who is more closely associated with the process, I think that can be a very interesting thing, because I've never attempted to write an opera, and I've never attempted to do something narrative on a larger scale before.
So lastly, where do you see your music going in the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, I think one thing that I've learned through being at Stanford, let's say, is that on the one hand, my music dramatically changes when I enter into a new place in my life and a new place in general. But also at the same time, like I said, there is something essential that's retained. I think that depending on where I end up, it'll in some ways inform how my music develops. And in other ways, I will have to kind of adapt to find myself once again in a new context. So there are certain things which are outside of my control, let's say, like I will go in the world wherever I'm drawn to. But in terms of things which I would like to explore, let's say, I have some more texts from my family that my father had found that I think would be interesting to incorporate as music in some sort of way. I have this, for example, this text from my great-great-grandmother, who was sort of the last of our family. She was orphaned at a young age in Sicily and was adopted by the archbishop of the town, and essentially he supported her at the church for a while until he realized she was actually very smart and actually very capable as I think she was mostly like a bookkeeper or someone who organized the finances or organized the events at the church. And so he sent her off to go attend a university in Palermo. And what happened was she got there and then everybody died of cholera.
Jeez.
Yeah. And so she survived that and actually met her husband while she was there, still at a young age. And so basically, being kind of the last of our family, she kind of held the entire lineage together, and she made a will and testament of this whole of her life essentially, and kind of laid out her role in this way. And so I have that with me, and
it's in Italian.
It's in Italian, and so I've translated it, and I've been reading it through, and I've translated it to be able to understand it in my own language, but
you haven't translated it for like poetic effect.
No, and I wouldn't want to. Okay. Something that I've noticed about my family in general is that despite being despite a lot of these documents being quite kind of clear accounts of things, there is a poetic element to all of it. Like the language that's used is begins in a descriptive sense, but kind of that description becomes poetic in a way. So I really am interested in kind of using those natural dynamics and expanding upon those without disrupting them, or just allowing them to kind of come to fruition, like sort of like tending a garden or something like that. So there's things like that I'd like to explore. I think with regards to working in the field, I think that obviously if I move to a new location, let's say, that'll change. Like the field is different.
Sure.
It'll be like, let's say I moved back to New York City. What a crazy place to be to try and get some cool sounds, I mean, it's one of the things I loved about growing up in the city is just the crazy people that you just encounter along the way. Like one of the things that I really liked to do when I was growing up was, let's say I had to take the train from downtown all the way uptown. I would get on the train, and then every time the stop changed, I would jump into the next car, because I just want to see the shuffling of the different people who would kind of emerge in each one. And you could see just like, there's a lot of interesting people out there, So I would think that, there are a lot of things that I would be able to find in a place like that, with this kind of new perspective on how to kind of capture sound and incorporate it, that would be a natural extension of this sort of thing. Because I am fundamentally a human being living in society also, and I have these, I don't have to necessarily just be focused purely on the natural. I can be, or on the natural world, on the wilderness. I can also incorporate society as a part of that frame. And that, again, that'll depend on wherever I am. On a technical level, I suppose that there are a lot of things that I've begun in the pieces that I've already started that some have seemed to kind of end in their own sort of proper way with a certain piece, or else they are relegated to being dormant until need arises again to incorporate them as an evolving sense of how that informs my aesthetic, or the goals that kind of present themselves because of a new context or a new development in another aspect of my composition. I guess at this point I'm kind of in a very open place where I think I've done quite a lot over the last several years, and I'm kind of eager to see how the new dramatic change in my life produces an effect both on my fundamental perspective on things, but also how the music can be kind of a reflection of that, because often I find that music really is a good measure of how my life is going, or how like what actually am I thinking? What actually am I feeling? It's kind of inarticulable in certain ways, and then once you have something that kind of emerges purely as an expressive form, then you're able to kind of sit with it and go, wow, I guess that's what was going on the whole time.
I think that's an excellent place to end.
Great.
Thank you, Nick.
Thank you, Andrew.
Time. Lots.
That was our interview with Nick Virzi, an American composer living in Woodside, California. More of his music is available at nickvirzi.com. That's nickvirzi.com. If you'd like to hear more episodes, our interviews are published regularly on Composer Overtime's YouTube, SoundCloud, Facebook page, and Instagram.
Zula.